Good morning. This is John Bushka. I just want to talk a little bit about the controversy over transgender identity in young people a little bit more and be a little more precise. Just for a picture, that's the cast iron building in New York City where I lived in the 1970s. That's just to introduce me. But let me go through. Let me introduce to you three articles from, well, actually, let me go first back to an NBC story, which I should mention first. Back in 2013, actually the end of 2012, because it was in December of 2012, the American Psychiatric Association announced that being transgender is no longer a mental disorder, and I'll give you the link for this. This is the NBC story. It could be sort of viewed as simply a situation or a developmental issue, but it's not considered a mental disorder, even though it might need treatment. And so that actually can have legal and political implications, just as in 1973, homosexuality itself was no longer to be viewed as a mental disorder. So let me move on to the National Library of Medicine papers. Actually, I could show you a picture of the NIH building. If I should have it. Right here. Because I was a patient there at the clinical center in 1962, so I'm kind of familiar with NIH. But anyway, one of the papers, just getting back here, just going back to the list, one of the papers is called Familial Patterning and Prevalence of Male and Androphilia Among Istmo-Zapotecan Men and Muxes in a state in southern Mexico. And that basically said that in this indigenous tribe, gay men were considered almost like a third gender, so to speak, like a gender identity. But that was broken up into men who were effeminate and then men who were normal cis men and were behaved in a masculine way. So it looks like they broke it up into two additional genders, and then it goes in and looks at some of the biological findings that they found, which was more that it had to do with familial heritage, autosomal genes, that sometimes in many family lineages, particularly on the maternal side, in many familial lineages, only a few people have the children. And a lot of times that's particularly true of women. Only a relatively few women have lots of children and the other people support them. And that also extends to men, that many of the men are supposed to behave altruistically and stay home and support their tribe, either as domestically or, in the case of the cis men, be extra warriors, or would go out and hunt or go out and defend the tribe from external enemies and so forth. And frankly, among mammals that are social, and carnivores, mammals that don't live solitary lives, and like most cats live solitary lives except for lions, but generally they do. So this doesn't apply to cats very much, but applies to wolves and applies to many species of animals, that relatively few of the adults have all the babies. And that's also, we know that that's true in other aspects of the animal world, like with social insects and so forth. So it's very common that the best result for the tribe as a whole is for the most fit people to have most of the babies and for the other people to help them. And that leads to a better genetic future for the entire tribe than does if everybody just has one or two, which sounds very harsh. It sounds like survival of the fittest. It sounds like eugenics, and it sounds like a lot of bad things. But this is what really happens in nature a lot of times. So that kind of gives some cover to the idea that at least in many Native American, many indigenous societies around the world, in the South Pacific especially, as well as the Americas, there were other categories of people who were sort of classified by gender. So the idea that it's happened in history is certainly supported by history, whether a lot of us like the idea or not. It certainly does happen. Another paper had to do with structural connections in the brain that are related to gender identity and sexual orientation. And this was an article. I'm just making sure I got the right one. This is the 5422. I got to go back and look at my cheat sheet here. That's actually the third article, but this one, the first article I talked about came from February of 2018. This one comes from December of 2017. So these are articles that have been around for 5 or 6 years. They're not real new. But the general idea is that probably sexual orientation in men has a lot to do with wiring of the cerebellum, and it seems to have a lot to do with instinct. And gay men, who are not even necessarily effeminate, and I'll get back to that in a minute, but gay men may be men who turned out to have less basic instinct because of the wiring of other aspects of their central nervous system, to be even interested in having intercourse with females for potential reproduction. They may need more, which in a sense stimulation or more input from their brain and their cognitive thinking to have sex or to have a sex life at all. And that seems to be the implication of what it says here. And gender identity is a little bit different. Gender identity is more that some people seem to have more an inclination to have more awareness of their bodies and have more discomfort with certain aspects of their bodies. And that again seems to have a genetic possibly a genetic component. What it said here is, at variance to the cis heterosexual controls of homosexual men and homosexual women displayed almost no differences in fractional, there's a term called factional I lost the anisotropy, which has to do with a tendency for anything to go out at angles as opposed to be perpendicular. It's a technical term in neurology. Moreover, homosexual women had significantly lower mean FA compared to heterosexual men only in the left CST, and relative to heterosexual women, homosexual women had seemingly but not significantly higher in their more male typical FA values. To the contrary, the direct comparison between homosexual men and heterosexual men showed no significant differences. Together, these data argue for less pronounced sexual differentiation of these white matter tracts among homosexuals compared to heterosexual cisgender persons, possibly due to more masculinization of long tracts in homosexual women and to a lesser degree a demasculinization of homosexual men. In other words, that seems to point to the idea of instinct to me, in line with reports about testosterone promoting white matter growth in the cerebellum. Such androgen effects are hypothesized to be linked to homosexuality. Homosexual men were previously found to have a more female-like interstitial nucleus of the anterior hypothalamus, thinner cuneus cortex, and smaller thalamic volumes compared to with heterosexual men. The finding of more pronounced sex atypical characteristics in homosexual women than homosexual men is at odds to reports of a less consistent sex atypical neurophysiological test in homosexual women in these further evaluations. Male and female homosexuality may be analogously manifested in the structural level of the human brain. So this kind of gets back to the idea that maybe it's because this particularly has to do with birth order, that people that are not firstborn sons may be more likely to find that these aspects of their brains are not as masculinized, so that they have this kind of instinct. Whereas the thing I talked about with the other article seems to have to do with genes, particularly autosomal genes. Genes are not necessarily on the X or Y chromosome, but genes on the other chromosomes that may be passed among families, and also certain genes that are thought to be passed only on the maternal side, which would be the X chromosome. That there seem to be some genes that have to do with clustering the tendency to have children, an interest in having children, and relatively few people having the interest in doing so, and relatively more people around them not having the interest, but hanging around and being supportive. And that was true on my mother's side of the family. There were not, a lot of the adults didn't have any children. My mother had only one child, me. A cousin had three, rather an uncle had three, and a cousin had two, but and then several other people didn't have any at all on my mother's side, and I didn't have any at all, and another cousin didn't have any at all. So in my family, I've always thought there's something genetic, and the family did well. A lot of it's in Ohio. Did well financially. People tended to be very prudent in the way they behaved, did very well in their careers. A lot of it was a farm, and then there was a gas well, and the people did very well financially, but they shared it among fewer people, which means the family is maybe in sort of could be dying out, or there's not as many people left to carry it on as there would have been from a lot of other families. But anyway, just to get back to the other article, there's another article which was in 2020, a little more recently, about brain sex differences related to gender identity development, genes or hormones. And don't think I made a lot of notes about that. I think, oh yes, it was that the point of this article was that there are different capacities that men and women tend to stress, and that men, particularly straight men, tend to have more capability with using spatial differences in their physical activity, and I was very weak in using spatial perception. Like, I remember getting a D in tumbling in physical education. It was the worst grade I ever got on a report card in 11th grade. I simply couldn't project my body through space. I didn't learn to ride a bicycle very well. A lot of things I didn't learn to do very well that was true. But then I was very verbal. Being very verbal, because men are also very verbal too, and very good with both abstraction, and because a lot of writers and most writers and composers throughout history have been men. Of course, that was another thing that had to do with the status of women until Amy Beach as a composer came along. But anyway, so those are the papers I kind of wanted to share with you this morning, and it's important to keep them in mind, because even though I don't like a lot of what's going on with gender identity. I don't like the idea of forcing pronouns, forcing other people to use them and sort of carry on something of a a corruption of language that's not based on fact, sort of postmodern. I don't like to see people doing that. I don't like to see that in schools. I think we should be very careful about treatments given to preteens and the affirmative care. I think from what I've read about it, a lot of it is very dangerous. Some of it may be okay, but it seems to be greatly overdone, and you're seeing the reaction in red states. You see what's going on. But there is some basis in the research that there are some differences in the brains among people who are basically totally conforming in terms of gender identity and sexual interest, and those are not. And there are differences between homosexual cis men and transgender people. Some people have been saying, well, most trans women, people who transitioned to women, would have just in early adulthood or in the end of youth would have grown up to be gay men. And that sounds like maybe you're trying to imply that most gay men are actually trans, but that's just not true. I mean, I've had many people, particularly when I was living in Dallas, like in the 1980s, tell me that most gay men were not like me. Most of them were not physically behind when they were growing up. So that's actually a myth. So it's a pretty complicated situation. But I wanted to just update everybody on that today. And thank you for listening.